The sun dipped low behind the jagged hills, casting long, dusty shadows across the dying fields of Eli McGraw's ranch. The land was brittle, and so was he. Once a proud cattleman with a bustling spread, Eli now spent his days in silence fixing broken gates, chasing off coyotes, and trying not to remember what it felt like to have a family. His wife had passed 4 winters ago, and the stillborn child they'd buried before her made sure his heart never fully recovered. Eli had stopped expecting company. Folks in town had long since stopped coming around. He liked it that way, or so he told himself. So when he heard the faint knock at the front porch just as the sky turned amber, he thought maybe he'd imagined it. But then it came again. He opened the door slowly, rifle in hand, and saw a sight that knocked the breath out of him. A woman dust-covered, thin, with hair tied back in a fraying ribbon, stood clutching a little girl by the shoulder. Behind her were 4 more children, each with dirt-smudged faces and tired eyes. Their clothes were worn thin, and the smallest boy wasn't wearing shoes. "I'm sorry to bother you," the woman said softly, her voice cracking. "We were walking the road and saw your well. The children, they need water." Eli's first instinct was suspicion. This was the kind of country where folks pretended to be in need just to rob you blind. But then he looked into her eyes clear, desperate, and holding back tears. "You got no wagon?" he asked gruffly. "No," she said, shaking her head. "It broke down 5 miles back. We've been walking since dawn." "And your husband?" "Dead." Eli hesitated. He didn't like strangers. He didn't like kids. And he sure didn't like feeling responsible for anyone else's burden. But something about the way the children clung to her legs, the way their sunburned faces turned toward the porch light, he couldn't turn them away. "Come around the side," he said. "Pump's there." She nodded, murmured a thank you, and guided the children to the well. They drank like they hadn't tasted water in days, and maybe they hadn't. He watched them quietly from the porch, rifle lowered now, but still close by. The oldest boy looked about 12 and was already helping the others fill a tin cup to pass around. The mother drank last dot when they were done. The woman walked back toward him. "I know it's a lot to ask, but we can sleep in the barn." "Just one night. We'll work for it if you need." Eli scratched his beard. "Ain't got much to feed you. We've had less." She said it without shame, without begging. Just the truth, plain and bare. That hit him harder than pleading ever could. "You got names?" he asked finally. "Clara. Clara Whitmore. And these are mine, Tommy, Ruth, Luke, Danny, and little Maisie." He looked at the kids. They were a mess, but they didn't whine. That told him more about Clara than her words ever could. "The barn's clean," he said at last. "Got some blankets and hay. If the little one needs milk, I got goats. You'll all eat what I eat, but it ain't fancy." Clara looked like she might cry, but didn't. That's more than enough. As they settled into the barn, Eli brought over a dented pot of beans, some cornbread, and a jug of goat's milk. He told himself he was just doing what any decent man would. But as he watched them eat with such quiet gratitude, something in him stirred a memory of what it meant to care, to protect, to feel like you weren't the only soul left on earth. That night, Eli couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of children breathing in the barn. For years, the silence of his home had been a comfort, but now it felt heavy. Empty dot something had shifted with that knock at sundown. He didn't know it yet, but the dusty ranch he'd nearly given up on was about to come alive again, not with money or rain, but with family, forged in desperation and fed by hope. By the time the morning sun stretched over the hills, the barn had come alive with hushed whispers, little footsteps, and the soft clinking of tin cups. Eli stood on the porch with a mug of black coffee in his hand, watching the first real movement on his land in months. The sight was strange, but not unwelcome. Clara and the children had cleaned up the corner of the barn where they'd slept. Blankets were folded neatly. The older boy, Tommy, had already fetched water for the goats without being asked. Clara had found a rag and was scrubbing out the old feed trough, not because he told her to, but because she didn't want to leave. Things worse than she'd found them. Eli didn't say much that morning. He was a man of few words and fewer attachments. But something about Clara's quiet determination pulled at the edges of his defenses. "I ain't running a boarding house," he said flatly as she approached the fence, wiping her hands on her skirt. "I don't expect you to," Clara replied. "But if you'll let us work, we can pay our way, even if it's just with labor." He studied her. Dirt streaked her face, her hands were rough, and her eyes were hollow from exhaustion, but her spine was straight. No shame in her voice, just grit. "What work can you do?" he asked, sipping his coffee. "I was raised on a farm outside of Abilene. I can mend, cook, plant, tend stock. The older kids can carry water, sweep, gather eggs if you've got chickens. They're good kids, Mr. McGraw. They'll earn their bread." He wasn't used to people asking for work. In these parts, folks either stole what they needed or rolled over and begged. But Clara didn't do either. "Name's Eli," he muttered. "You know anything about mending a sagging fence line?" Clara looked toward the back pasture. "I saw a few posts leaning when we walked up yesterday." "Yes, sir, I do." "Then get the hammer from the shed and keep the kids close. There's rattlers that way." She nodded once and turned back toward the barn, her gait steady even after days on foot. Eli watched her go, then glanced down at his coffee. It was still hot, but something inside him felt like it was slowly thawing. By noon, he found her driving nails into the splintered post near the west edge. Tommy helped hold the boards in place, and the younger kids picked rocks out of the path nearby. No whining. No idling. Just worked out at midday, Eli brought out a small lunch, biscuits, salted pork, and more goat's milk. They all gathered under the shade of the mesquite tree, devouring the food without a sound. Clara made sure each child ate before she took a bite herself. That didn't go unnoticed. After they ate, Clara stood and wiped her hands. "What else do you need done? You planning to work straight through sundown?" Eli asked, one brow raised. "If that's what it takes." Eli nodded toward the hen house. "Roost is falling apart. 2 hens haven't laid in days. Might be worth checking." Clara didn't smile, but there was a flicker of light behind her tired eyes. "Yes, sir." The rest of the day passed with the sound of life returning. To the ranch hammers tapping, little feet running, chickens clucking, and once laughter. Eli didn't know when he last heard that sound on his land, and it hit him in the gut like a memory he'd tried too hard to bury. By sunset, Clara had mended 2 fence posts, patched a piece of roof on the chicken coop, and wrangled 3 children into a working wash line behind the barn. The ranch was still dry, still cracked, still broken, but for the first time in a long while, it didn't feel empty. As he stood outside his house watching the sky blaze orange and red, Clara approached, with her sleeves rolled up and dirt on her face. "We'll move on tomorrow," she said. "We've taken more than we've given. I don't want to overstay." Eli didn't answer right away. He looked out over the land, then down at his boots. "You ain't overstayed. I'll pay you what I can if you stay another day or 2. "Lot more work needs doing." Clara blinked, caught off guard. "You sure?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah, you're fixing more than fences." Clara said nothing, just gave a small nod, as if they'd struck a deal that needed no more words. And just like that, a hard bargain was made, not with money or contracts, but with trust. The kind that starts small and grows deeper, one day at a time. The morning air was cooler than usual, with a breeze rustling the dry weeds across the front yard. Eli stood on the porch with his coffee, same as every morning, but this time he wasn't alone. Little Danny sat cross-legged on the steps, humming quietly as he whittled at a stick with a butter knife Clara had let him borrow. The boy hadn't said much, but Eli didn't mind. Silence was something he understood. Inside the barn, Clara stirred the fire in the old cast-iron stove and cooked a modest breakfast of cornmeal mush. It wasn't fancy, but it filled the children's bellies. She'd been on her feet since dawn, already mended a torn boot sole and drawn water for the goats. This ranch, as broken as it was, had given them more than they'd seen in months. Still, Clara never let herself relax completely, even when she smiled at the children or exchanged a quiet nod with Eli. There was tension in her shoulders, a readiness to run. She'd carried that burden since the day she left that mining town behind, after breakfast. While the kids helped Tommy repair the old wagon wheel out back, Clara joined Eli near the woodpile. She took up the axe beside him without asking. "You don't have to do that," he said. She shrugged. "I can swing an axe just fine. Besides, keeps my hands busy." They worked in rhythm for a while. Chop, split, stack. Eli glanced at her a few times, taking note of the scar along her wrist and the bruising around her knuckles that hadn't faded yet. Eventually, he broke the silence. "Your husband," he said quietly. "How long's he been gone?" Clara didn't answer right away. She set a log on the chopping block, split it in one clean swing, and stared down at the wood. "Almost 2 years now," she said at last. "Died in a shaft collapse up in Coal Ridge?" Eli nodded slowly. "Accident?" "Wasn't. Working his shift. His brother was, but Matthew went in after him when the tunnel cracked. Got them both buried." Eli's jaw tightened. "You were left with the kids and no income?" "Worse," Clara said. "I was left with debt, too." His brother Henry had been gambling and drinking through every cent. After Matthew died, Henry came around saying I owed him for the funeral, for the land, for everything. Said he'd take the children if I couldn't pay. "Take your kids?" Eli's voice dropped low with disbelief. Clara met his eyes. "Claimed he had every right. He tried to file custody with the town judge, said I was unfit. He said women without property and husbands had no business raising 5 mouths." Eli clenched his fists. The idea of anyone trying to separate Clara from those children after everything she'd endured stirred something deep and protective in him. "So you ran." "I waited until nightfall," she said. "Packed what I could. Took the back trail out of town and didn't stop moving." He saw it then, not just a woman trying to survive, but a mother who'd risked everything to keep her family together. "They'll come looking," Clara added quietly. "Henry won't let it go. He's mean and petty, and he's got a way of making folks believe him." Eli looked out over the hills, eyes narrowed. "Let them come. They won't find you alone here." Clara turned toward him, her breath caught slightly. "You don't owe me that." "I don't owe anyone," he said. "But this land, it hasn't had much worth in years. Maybe keeping you safe gives it some." Her eyes shimmered with unspoken gratitude, but she didn't cry. She was too proud for that. "I just want them to have a chance," she whispered. "A roof, a school, a life," Eli nodded. "Then we'll give them one. Together." The promise hung between them, quiet but solid. That night after supper, the children fell asleep curled up with full bellies and dusty feet. Clara sat on the porch steps, arms wrapped around her knees, staring at the stars. Eli sat beside her, not close, but not distant either. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like running. And for the first time in an even longer time, he didn't feel so alone. The days stretched long on the ranch, but they were no longer empty dot by mid-morning. The sun beat down hard, drying the cracked earth into fine powder. But Clara and the children worked alongside Eli like they'd always belonged. What was once silence and solitude had turned into movement, footsteps padding across the porch, hammers clinking, and children laughing between chores. The transformation didn't happen all at once. It began with bread. Clara rose early one morning and, using a little flour, lard, and goat's milk, she kneaded dough on the old wooden counter in Eli's kitchen. The smell of rising bread filled the house like a memory Eli didn't know he missed. She didn't ask permission. She just did it because that's what a woman who planned to stay did. When Eli came in from checking the water troughs and smelled the yeasty warmth, he stopped short in the doorway. "You baking?" he asked, his voice gravelly with surprise. Clara glanced over her shoulder, her hands still dusted in flour. "Wasn't sure if you'd mind." He didn't answer. Instead, he walked over, tore off a warm corner of the loaf cooling on the table, and popped it in his mouth. "Mind? Haven't tasted bread like this in 5 years." Clara smiled, small but real. From then on, the kitchen became hers. She cleaned it top to bottom, lined shelves with burlap, and taught Ruth how to stir stew without burning the bottom. Eli started eating meals at the table again, meals made by someone who knew how to stretch nothing into something. The work outside was no easier. The fields were dry and stubborn, but Clara didn't complain. She hauled buckets, mended fences, and even helped dig a trench to redirect runoff toward the garden she insisted on planting. "Ain't nothing gonna grow in that soil," Eli warned, watching her press bean seeds into the dirt. "Maybe not," Clara said, wiping sweat from her brow, "but hope's better than hunger." Eli couldn't argue with that. Tommy took to ranch life fast. He helped Eli patch the barn roof, learned to saddle a horse, and even rounded up 2 missing goats by himself. Eli, usually tight-lipped and guarded, found himself offering quiet bits of advice, correcting the boy's grip on a lasso or showing him how to oil leather properly. One afternoon, Eli handed Tommy a pocket knife, his own from boyhood. "You earned it," he said simply. "Keep it sharp. Respect it." Tommy nodded, his chest swelling with quiet pride. He didn't say much, but the way he tucked that knife into his boot told Eli everything. Luke, the younger son, followed Eli around like a shadow, asking questions about every tool, every animal, every sound the wind made through the grass. At first, Eli found it exhausting, but soon he realized he didn't mind the boy's chatter. It filled the silences that had once echoed like grief. Even the smallest one, Maisie, began to bloom. Once shy and clinging to Clara's skirts, she now carried feed in a tin pail and greeted Eli with a crooked little smile that tugged at something deep in his chest. But the real bond, one that shifted something unspoken, happened one evening. After a long day of fencing, Clara, barefoot and sore, sat on the porch steps soaking her feet in a basin of cool water. Eli brought out a small jar of liniment and set it beside her without a word. She looked at it, then at him. "For me?" He nodded. "You've earned more than bruises around here." She said nothing, but her fingers brushed his as she took the jar. It was the first time they'd touched skin to skin, and the warmth of it lingered long after the sun dipped behind the hills. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed, Clara sat by the fire sewing up a rip in Eli's only good shirt. He watched her in the flickering light, the way her hands moved gently, purposefully. The house no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like something being rebuilt brick by emotional brick. "You didn't have to do that," he murmured, nodding toward the shirt. "I know," she said, "but I wanted to." It was a simple exchange, but it carried the weight of something deeper. Trust, respect, maybe even the first quiet threads of love. For the first time in years, Eli went to bed not thinking about what he'd lost, but what he might be gaining out of bread, blisters, and bonding. Something stronger than survival was taking root on that dusty ranch. Something that looked a whole lot like home. The ranch had never known such quiet purpose. Days began with Clara's baking and ended with Eli's low whistle calling the goats in from pasture. The children fell into a rhythm of work and rest. There was even laughter again, especially when Luke managed to ride one of the goats like a bucking bronco, or when Danny caught a fat frog in the garden and chased Ruth with it around the well. But peace is never permanent on the edge of nowhere. Especially not when trouble has a long memory. It was a Thursday morning when the sound of hooves broke the usual stillness. Clara was gathering eggs and L.A. was in the tool shed with Tommy when the rider came into view, a dust-covered man in a brown coat, wide hat low over his eyes. His horse looked as weary as he did. Eli recognized the sheriff's badge before he recognized the man. "Morning, Eli," the sheriff said, pulling his horse to a stop near the porch. Heard the place had come alive again. Eli squinted into the sun. "Mornin', Sam. Thought you gave up this route." "I did," the sheriff replied, "but your name came up in town. Folks say you've got company now." Eli didn't move. "And is that a problem?" The sheriff sighed and swung down from his horse. He dusted off his sleeves, then glanced around at the clothesline with children's garments, the garden sprouting small green leaves, the bucket of fresh goat milk on the porch. "Depends," he said slowly. "You got a woman and 5 children. Living here?" Eli didn't answer. Sam glanced toward the barn, where Clara had just emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes met the sheriff's, and her whole body went still. "Well, I'll be," Sam muttered. "That's her, ain't it, Clara Whitmore?" Clara approached, calm but pale. "Sheriff, ma'am," he tipped his hat. "Didn't think I'd see you again. Cole Ridge has been asking questions." Eli stepped forward, voice firm. "What kind of questions?" Sam sighed again, clearly uncomfortable. Her late husband's brother Henry Whitmore came to town with legal papers. Says Clara ran off with the children without permission. He's filed a petition for custody. Claims she's mentally unfit and incapable of providing for them. "That man's a liar," Clara snapped, her voice tight. "He threatened to take my children, Sheriff. Said he'd use the courts to do it." "I had no choice." Sam raised a hand. "I believe you, Clara. I do. Folks know Henry's a bitter drunk, but he's got money now. Won a pile playing poker over in Dodge. Hired himself a lawyer." Eli's eyes narrowed. "So what does that mean?" "It means," Sam said slowly, "that men could be coming. Bounty hunters. Deputized or not, if Henry pays them enough, they'll come looking to drag Clara back or take those kids." Clara's face drained of color. She took a shaky step backward. "He'd do it. He said he would." Eli looked at Sam. "Is she safe here?" "For now," Sam said. "But if Henry's claim makes it through the court, it'll be harder. If you two aren't kin or married, the law might side with blood." Clara blinked, stunned. "Married?" Sam shrugged. "I'm not saying you should. Just telling you the law is old out here. Doesn't favor women on the run." Eli's jaw clenched. His land, his home, this family forming under his roof, they could be torn apart with one signature and a dusty courthouse. Sam glanced between the two of them, then swung back onto his horse. "I'm just the messenger, Eli, but if I were you, I'd keep a rifle close. And think hard about how permanent you want this arrangement to be." He tipped his hat and rode off, the sound of hooves fading into the heat. Silence settled. Clara stared at the horizon, arms wrapped tightly around herself. "I ran so far," she whispered, "and he still found me." Eli stepped closer, voice quiet but firm. "You're not running anymore." She looked at him, eyes wide, heart thudding. "Eli, if they come, they'll have to go through me," he said. "And this land doesn't take kindly to men like Henry Whitmore." For a long moment, she just looked at him, this gruff, wounded man who had no reason to care. yet was slowly becoming the only anchor she had left. "Thank you," she said, voice trembling. He didn't reply. He just nodded and walked toward the barn. But in his mind, a storm was already forming. He didn't know what would come next, but whatever it was, he wasn't letting them take her. Or those kids not without a fight. The air shifted in the days that followed the sheriff's visit. The laughter that once echoed across the fields became quieter, more cautious. Clara double-checked the locks on the barn doors each night. Eli cleaned and reloaded every rifle he owned. A sense of something coming, something dark and inevitable, hung over the ranch like smoke before a blaze. Still, life didn't stop. The garden grew taller under Clara's careful tending. The goats were fattening up again, and Eli taught Tommy how to ride a horse with a steady hand and a strong back. The children smiled, though more hesitantly, and Clara kept her chin high, refusing to let fear undo the safety they'd worked so hard to build. But Eli could feel it like the pressure before a thunderstorm. The land knew trouble was on its way. It came one night when the wind was dry and hot and the stars were hidden by a curtain of cloudless darkness. Clara had just settled Maisie into her blanket nest in the barn's hayloft when Eli burst through the doors, voice low but urgent. "Clara, get the kids, now." She didn't ask questions. One look at his face and she knew something was wrong. "Smoke," he said, "coming from the east fence line." She gathered the children while Eli sprinted toward the pasture. Flames flickered in the distance, orange tongues licking the dry grass, fanned by the rising wind. Someone had lit it deliberately. There hadn't been lightning. No storm, this was man-made. The fire was fast. Eli grabbed a shovel and started digging a trench, trying to cut it off before it reached the barn. Tommy ran beside him with buckets of water. Clara formed a line with the other kids, soaking burlap sacks and slapping down embers before they could catch. It was chaos, but controlled chaos. Sweat poured down their faces, but no one stopped. Not even Maisie, who stood clutching a cup of water in trembling hands, waiting for someone to need her. The fire pushed closer, then stalled, trapped by the narrow trench Eli had carved and drowned by the buckets Clara and Tommy kept pouring over it. After nearly an hour, the flames hissed down into smoke and ash. They had stopped it. But barely. Eli stood at the edge of the blackened field, chest heaving. His shirt clung to his back, soaked with sweat and soot. Clara approached, face smeared with ash, her dress torn at the hem. Behind her, the children huddled together, coughing but safe. "That wasn't random," Eli muttered, eyes scanning the dark horizon. "No," Clara whispered. "That was a message." Eli nodded grimly. "They're getting close." She looked around the ranch, her sanctuary, and saw the glowing embers scattered across the field like silent threats. "What do we do now?" He turned to her, jaw tight. "We prepare." That night, no one slept. Eli stood guard with a rifle across his lap while Clara watched the children sleep in a tight circle inside the barn. It was the safest place now, cooler, surrounded by earth and stone, and easier to defend. At dawn, Eli rode into town. He came back with nails, boards, an extra feed, but also news. "Henry's hired a man named Clive Maddox," he said as he dismounted. "Ex-soldier. Runs with a pair of bounty riders. No regard for the law unless it pays better." Clara paled. "He's sending them here?" Eli nodded. "Soon." She wrapped her arms around herself. "They'll take the children, even if they have to burn this place down to do it." Eli looked at her hard, his voice low and deliberate. "They'll try, but they won't succeed." She met his gaze, and in it, she saw something stronger than kindness. Something unshakable. Protection, loyalty, maybe even love, though neither dared name it yet. "I can't let you get hurt," she said softly. "You're not the only one who's lost someone, Clara." he replied. "But you and those kids, you've brought something back to this place, and I'll be damned if I let anyone take that away." She stepped closer, inches from him now, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then we stand together." They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. In that moment, their partnership became something sacred, born not of convenience, but of fire and shared defiance. Whatever was coming next, they'd face it, together. And if the horizon burned again, they'd be ready. The fire had changed everything, though the blaze had been stopped. The message was clear. Henry Whitmore and the men he'd hired would stop at nothing. They weren't just coming to collect Clara. They were coming to take her children, destroy the life she was building, and claim legal ground with paper, money, and cruelty. Clara had seen men like Henry win before. Men who walked into courtrooms with polished boots and lies, while women like her were treated like burdens or afterthoughts. She couldn't let that happen again. Not this time. Not after all they had survived. That's why the morning after the fire, when Eli handed her a cup of coffee on the porch, Clara looked at him and said, "I think we both know there's only one way to stop them." He didn't need to ask what she meant. The words hung between them like a curtain waiting to fall. Eli nodded slowly. Marriage. Clara stared out at the horizon, her hands tight around the mug. "I'm not asking out of love. I'm asking because the law won't listen to anything less. If we're married," Eli said, finishing the thought, "the land becomes yours too. The children would be considered under my care, and no court would hand them over to some drunken gambler with a grudge." She looked at him, her expression careful. "Do you really want to tie yourself to a woman with 5 children and a trail of trouble behind her?" Eli set his mug down on the porch rail. "Clara, you've done more good for this ranch in a month than I've seen in 5 years. You brought this place back to life. And I've watched you fight for those kids like a grizzly bear. I'd be proud to stand beside you." Clara swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Then I reckon we do it." The ceremony was simple. No white dress, no flowers, no music. Just Eli in a clean shirt, Clara in her best skirt, and the children standing close by with dust on their boots and hope in their eyes. They rode into town the next day in Eli's wagon. The sheriff, who'd given them the warning, performed the vows behind his office with nothing but the wind and a stray dog for witnesses. "You sure about this, Eli?" the sheriff asked one last time. Eli nodded without hesitation. "I've never been more sure." Clara's voice didn't tremble when she said, "I do," but her hands were shaking. Eli took them in his as gently as he could, strong but steady, and she felt something deeper than legal protection in that grip. It wasn't a love story, not yet, but it was a promise. And in Clara's world, promises meant more than flowers or lace. Afterward, they returned to the ranch as husband and wife. The children curled together in the back of the wagon, sleepy but safe. That evening, Clara stood at the edge of the porch, watching the last sliver of sun slip behind the hills. Eli stepped up beside her, silent as usual. "Feels strange," she murmured, "being married again." "Not much has changed," Eli said gently. "You're still you. I'm still me. Just now there's paper saying I've got your back." She smiled at that. "You already did?" They stood quietly for a while, the breeze brushing her skirt, the chickens clucking softly in the distance. "I didn't expect this," she admitted. "Neither did I," he said. "But some things are worth the risk." A soft sound broke the silence, a child's voice calling from inside. "Mama?" Clara turned. "Coming, sweetheart." She looked back at Eli. "Thank you for all of this." He nodded once, hands in his pockets. "We're in it now, and I don't back out once. I saddle up." Clara went inside to tuck the children in, and for the first time since she'd fled Coleridge, she felt something solid beneath her feet, not fear, Not survival, but a future. She was no longer just a desperate mother running from a man with money and papers. She was a wife, a partner, a woman standing on land that was hers by right, by grit, and by a man's quiet, unwavering choice to stand beside her. Whatever came next, she was no longer facing it alone. It happened on a Tuesday. The skies were strangely still, the kind of stillness that made birds go quiet and horses shuffle in their stalls. Clara felt it before she saw anything, a pressure in her chest, an ache in her gut. Eli noticed it too. He had been mending a harness in the barn when he suddenly stopped, stood up straight, and scanned the far ridge. Then the dust rose. 3 riders appeared out of the haze like ghost shadows with saddlebags, rifles, and too much confidence. One of them rode ahead, high in the saddle, coat flapping behind him like a flag. Clara froze when she saw him. Henry Whitmore. He hadn't changed much. Still had that slicked hair and smug smirk. But now he looked more dangerous, heavily armed, with a pair of mean-eyed men flanking him like wolves on the scent. "Inside," Eli said firmly, already moving to unhook his rifle from the porch. "No," Clara replied, her voice like flint. "I need to face him." The children had gathered near the doorway, Tommy instinctively putting himself in front of the younger ones. Clara turned to them. "Back room. Lock the door. Do not come out until I say." They obeyed without a word. These weren't soft children. They'd learned long ago how to spot real danger. Henry rode right up to the front gate, leaned on the horn of his saddle, and smiled. "Well, well, look at this." Little Runaway set herself up with a rancher. Eli stepped forward, calm and solid. "You're trespassing," Henry's eyes glinted, "and you're harboring a fugitive. My late brother's widow who fled town with his children and left behind quite a mess." "She left to protect her kids," Eli replied. "You don't." "Own them. I've got papers say I do." Clara came to Eli's side then, back straight, chin high. "You forged those papers." Henry's smile widened. "Let the court decide that, sweetheart." "You want to talk legal?" Eli asked, reaching into his vest. "We got married. Town records fresh. She's Mrs. McGraw now, and those children are under my protection. You try and take them, you'll answer to me, and to the law." One of Henry's hired men sneered. "Law don't mean much out here." Eli leveled his rifle. "Then you—" "Better pray I do." For a tenth second, no one moved. Dust swirled. Horses stamped. The only sound was the wind whispering across the empty pasture. Then Henry chuckled, slow and mocking. "You're real proud of yourself, huh? You think putting a ring on her finger changes anything. You think that makes you a father to those kids?" "No," Eli said, "but I act like one. And that's more than you ever did." That shut Henry up. The smirk faltered, and his hand twitched near his belt. His men stiffened, watching Eli carefully. "I'll take this to court." Henry growled. "This ain't over." "You do that," Eli said. "But if you show up on my land again without a warrant, you won't walk away." Henry hesitated, chewing on his pride. Then he spat in the dust and tugged his reins hard. "Come on," he snapped to his men. "This place stinks of goat and desperation." The 3 of them rode off, kicking up dust and threats behind them. Clara didn't breathe until they were out of sight. Then she sagged slightly, the adrenaline catching up to her. Eli turned to her. "You all right?" She nodded, though her hands were shaking. "I will be." They went inside. The children came out of the back room one by one, wide-eyed but unharmed. Clara gathered them into her arms, whispering reassurances even as her own voice trembled. Later, as the sun fell and the sky turned gold and violet, Eli stood on the porch sharpening a blade. Clara joined him, arms crossed, eyes on the horizon. "He'll go to court now," she said quietly. "He's not the type." to let go once he's embarrassed. We'll be ready, Eli said. And we've got truth on our side. Is that enough? She asked. Eli looked at her, his voice steady. It is when you've got a family to fight for. She didn't answer. She just leaned her shoulder lightly against his arm. The battle wasn't over, but something had shifted. Henry had come with power, but he'd found something stronger waiting. Unity, resolve, and a man who'd chosen love over fear, and that made all the difference. Days passed without a sign of Henry or his hired guns. The ranch settled into something resembling peace again, though everyone knew it was only the calm between storms. Still, in that quiet, life pushed forward. The children went back to their chores, laughter returning in bursts like scattered wildflowers. Clara baked every morning, her bread growing fluffier, her smile a little easier. Eli repaired the barn door with Tommy, taught Luke how to saddle a mule, and began drawing plans for a second chicken coop. And then, one afternoon, something happened no one expected. It rained. It started as a whisper soft drops on the tin roof, light enough to doubt. But within minutes, it became a steady rhythm, washing over the land like forgiveness. Eli stood at the porch edge, hand resting on a post, eyes wide as he watched the dry soil drink deep for the first time in months. Clara stepped outside, apron still on, and lifted her face to the sky. The children came running barefoot, yelling, arms outstretched. Ruth spun in circles, Maisie danced in a puddle, and Danny whooped with joy as Luke chased him across the muddy yard. Even Tommy, usually serious beyond his years, smiled as rain slicked his hair down to his eyes. Clara let herself truly laugh for the first time in what felt like years. It's like the land was waiting for something, she said, glancing at Eli, like it knew it needed us. He looked at her, water beating in his beard. Maybe it was. They stood in the doorway together, soaked and silent, watching their ragtag family bloom in the storm. Eli's hand brushed hers. She didn't move away. The next few days were full of muddy boots and garden blessings. The beans Clara had nearly given up on began to push through the soil, green and stubborn. Wildflowers began to dot the hills. The cracked earth started to soften. Life was returning to the land and to the people living on it. But the rain didn't just nourish. It stirred old roots too. One morning, a letter arrived. The sheriff brought it himself, rain damp and creased. It's from the court in Coleridge, he said. Henry's filed formal charges. He wants the children returned to him, says Clara kidnapped them and endangered their welfare. Court dates in 2 weeks. Clara's face went pale. He's really going through with it. Afraid so, the sheriff said. You'll have to appear, but there's more. He hesitated, scratching his neck. What? Eli asked, sharply. The judge assigned to the case? Friend of Henry's. Played poker with him for years. Clara's shoulders slumped. So we're walking into a trap. The sheriff looked at Eli, then back at Clara. Not if you go in with witnesses, testimonies, evidence that the children are thriving. Eli nodded slowly. Then that's what we'll bring. That afternoon, the ranch became a flurry of preparation. Clara gathered old records, birth certificates, her marriage license to Eli, school books showing Ruth and Tommy had resumed lessons. Eli wrote letters to neighbors who'd seen the children's condition improve. The sheriff agreed to testify to. And through it all, the rain continued. Steady, quiet, cleansing. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Clara sat on the porch with Eli, her sewing basket in her lap. He was carving a new wooden handle for the pitchfork. They worked in silence until Clara finally spoke. I'm scared. Eli didn't look up. So am I. I've run so long. All I ever did was survive. But now ... I want more. I want them to have more. A home. A future. You've built that here, Eli said gently. And you're not alone. Anymore. She set the sewing aside and looked at him fully. You've done more for us than anyone ever has. Why? He paused, then met her eyes. Because you gave this place a reason to live again. You brought life to land I thought was dead. And because maybe I needed saving too. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she smiled as she brushed it away. Outside. The rain softened to a mist. It wasn't just water falling from the sky anymore. It was healing. The courthouse in Coal Ridge was small, but the weight of its walls could crush the unprepared. Clara stood on the worn wooden floor, her back straight. Her children seated behind her in clothed clothes, their faces scrubbed, their eyes watching. Her with quiet, fragile hope. Eli stood beside her, his hat in hand, a calm but unshakable presence. Across the room sat Henry Whitmore, looking smug and polished, wearing a suit that didn't fit his cruel character. His lawyer, sharp and smug, shuffled papers with the confidence of a man who expected to win. The judge, an old friend of Henry's, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, gaze hard to read. The case was called to order. Henry spoke first, painting. Clara, as an unfit mother, unstable, widowed, living without income, dragging children across the frontier with no plan. He claimed she'd endangered their lives, squatted on land that wasn't hers, and manipulated a desperate rancher into marrying her for protection. Clara didn't flinch. She'd heard worse. She'd lived worse. Then it was her turn. She stood before the court and spoke without notes. My husband died working underground to feed our family, she began. His brother, this man, tried to take what was left of our lives and use it for his own gain. So I ran. I ran because no one in that town believed a woman over a man with money. Her voice trembled, but she did not stop. I didn't kidnap my children. I saved them. And when I had nothing left, I found a man who gave us not just shelter, but dignity. We've rebuilt something on that land. My children have a home, chores, lessons, laughter. I'm not asking you to understand why I left. I'm asking you to see what we've become. She stepped back, her head high. Then Eli approached the bench. The room went still as he set down a leather-bound journal, his late wife's, full of entries about the ranch, about the emptiness he'd lived with for years. Then he spoke. I didn't marry Clara to save her, he said plainly. I married her because she saved this place. I'd given up on the land, on life. And then she showed up with 5 hungry children and more fight in her than I've seen in any man. She's not a burden. She's the reason I remembered how to live. He turned to the judge, voice steady. And if you think handing those children to Henry Whitmore is justice, then you've never seen real family before. Gasps echoed in the courtroom. Even the judge shifted. Then the sheriff stood and gave his testimony, how he found the children healthy and safe, how Clara and Eli had brought life back to a dying ranch. When the judge called recess to deliberate, Henry rose, livid. This ain't over, Clara. You think this is the end? I'll buy another lawyer, find another court. Clara met his eyes, unwavering. You've lost, Henry. You just don't know it yet. An hour later, the court reconvened. The judge cleared his throat. After reviewing testimony and evidence, and considering the welfare of the children involved, I rule in favor of Mrs. Clara McGraw and her husband, Mr. Eli McGraw. Full custody is granted. Petition denied. Clara gasped, and then the tears came. Ruth hugged her tightly. Tommy squeezed her hand. Maisie clapped her little hands with joy. Henry stormed out. Defeated. Outside the courthouse, the sun broke through the clouds, lighting the town in gold. Clara stood beside Eli on the steps, her hand in his. We won, she whispered. We did, he replied. But it wasn't the papers that did it. She looked up at him, curious. It was you, he said. Your strength. Your love for those kids. That's what saved this family. She smiled through her tears. It's our family now. He nodded, then leaned down and kissed her soft, sure, and full of something they hadn't dared speak aloud until now. Love. Real. Earned. Rooted. In survival and forged in fire. They rode home in the wagon, the children singing softly, the wind warm against their cheeks. And when the ranch came into view, the garden green, the chickens clucking, the hills kissed by sun, Clara felt something rise in her chest. Home. It had once been just dust and desperation. Now, it was hers. This. A family sealed not just by marriage, but by a vow deeper than any spoken in court, to fight for each other, to protect what mattered, and to never, ever let go.